language programs and policies of Serbia. Before we start, what makes Serbia different from other countries? If you want to know why, continue to the video then. Serbia represents an excellent example of language policy and planning through language management, which has resulted in the creation of a standard language culture. Standard languages are by definition social constructs, and in standard language cultures, they are viewed as symbols of national statehood, and choices made by language managers or language planners become interpreted as universal truths by societies at large. Consequently, they are constructed as language ideologies which are often explicitly articulated even though they are not so frequently applied in communicative practices. Standard language cultures, such as the Serbian one, are resistant to any type of change in standard language structures and insensitive to social, cultural, and political shifts in cultural models of given societies. Linguistic variety at great cost to a large majority of grade school and high school students in Serbia. An alternative approach to language education policy based on language leadership, which includes relevant professional communities of practice and interests, provides a way out of this deadlock situation which has been frustrating both the students and the Serbian language teachers in many parts of Serbia for decades. Speech communities, just as all other types of social organizations, are traditionally organized as hierarchies. In terms of language policy and planning in standard language cultures, these are embodied in top-down language management practices. However, speech communities, as all other social organizations and all living organisms, can also self-organize without externally or internally imposed hierarchies and form alternative inner structures within their communities of practice or interest in different aspects of their private, public, and professional lives, based on the concepts of hierarchy rather than hierarchy. Heterarchy is an emergent self-organizing form with lateral or distributed authority, and heterarchic organizations are based on relations of interdependence, characterized by minimal hierarchy and by either technist or complex organizations or systems. When they function as complex systems, they become adaptable, flexible, intelligent, resilient, and self-renewable, capable of promptly and accurately responding to change. Each organization or community is in the process of constant change and receives an endless influx of information. A mechanicist organization or community views any call for change as a serious disturbance as it strives to maintain the status quo. Within the scope of language management in standard language cultures, this implies the lack of sensitivity to any bottom-up language planning initiative to correlate standard language communicative practices with the changing needs of different communities of practice. In complex of social organizations, everything that disturbs the order of things plays a crucial role in the creation of a new, higher level of complexity. A heterarchic community chooses whether to respond or not to the new information it receives and which responses to apply if and when it decides to react to it. Thus, it maintains its identity and succeeds in self-organizing itself at a higher level of complexity. A new organization then emerges in a form which is much better equipped to deal with the challenges of change in its structure. This represents a paradigm for a new approach to bottom-up, leadership-based language policy and planning that can be carried out in standard language cultures. Speech communities in which standard languages are understood as the principal carriers of national and individual uniqueness are systems whose identities are clearly recognizable and thus cannot be lost if changes are introduced into them. If, instead of applying top-down, standard language management, we allow bottom-up language leadership within interested communities of practice to evolve, we might see a birth of a language policy based on emergent language behavior. Emergent language behavior is characterized by a language number of high-quality and low-intensity communicative interactions within self-organized communities of practice. High-quality interactions imply that the community of practice behaves in accordance with jointly defined goals and objectives, while the term low-intensity implies that language practice is carried out in the spirit of cooperation and goodwill. These language practices can be analyzed as de facto language policies, created and implemented through different types of communicative behavior, not ruled by official documents, declarations, and other top-down mechanisms of language management. Such language planning would be sensitive to social, cultural, and political change and ever-changing communicative needs of interested parties, which, as can be seen from research on bottom-up language policy and planning, might contradict the existence de jure language policies if we accept that our speech communities should behave as described within the complexity theory, and we treat them as complex networks which adopt new information and use it to reshape their own structures in order to respond to different organizations and communicative needs. It becomes clear that emergent language behavior may create an extremely useful input for the creation of new attitudes towards standard languages. Hierarchical social organization may thus be replaced by a heterarchic, complex organizational structure in which language leaders work together with language managers. The role of a leader can be presumed by any member of a community, as opposed to be the role of language managers who are defined by their fixed, privileged positions within social or scientific, cultural, political hierarchies. Of course, successful examples of bottom-up language policy and planning are not unheard of or undocumented. In light of the fact that in Serbia, as in many other standard language cultures, there is a highly centralized, institutionalized language management in practice. In the following section, we present a possible shift from language management to language leadership in the Serbian language education policy, which may bridge the gap between language managers and language practitioners as described by Resento and Homburger. The standardization process of Serbian began in the 18th century in the parts of Austro-Hungarian Empire populated by Serbs. The first language managers in this case were the Austro-Hungarian state and the Serbian Orthodox Church. The Austro-Hungarian authorities made serious efforts to Catholicize the Serbian Orthodox population. The beginning of the 19th century in Serbia was marked by the uprisings against the Turks and by attempts to liberate the region from the centuries-long Ottoman rule. Moreover, European concepts of modernity were introduced in all parts of Balkan Peninsula, and with them, European notions of national awakening. The idea of nation-state and the concepts of a national language as the carrier of national identity were consequently gaining ground throughout the region. The newly founded Serbian state exercised this approach to its national identity, expressing it through a clearly defined national standardized linguistic variety. It has been maintained within the framework of standard language cultures, in which standard language posits one of the pillars of national identity and unity, and it has been understood as the most important culture and historical heritage. Standard language cultures, such as the Serbian one, are characterized by specific language ideologies, promoted through top-down language policy and planning, in which language management plays a crucial role. They are normally rather insensitive to social, cultural, and other changes reflected in communicative practices of given speech communities. Serbian language education policy represents an excellent example of such a rigid approach to language status, its form, function, and language overall role in educational system. Until very recently, a very strict choice of standard variety based on the consensus reached in the second half of the 19th century has been applied, imposed by academic institutions of higher learning and adopted uncritically by all strata of the population as a language ideology not reflected in language practices. regardless of the fact that it has never become the variety of the majority of the urban population of Serbia. That standard has been present in the language education policy and implemented at all levels of formal education in Serbia for the longest time. Therefore, in this report, an overview of consequences of such a top-down language education policy based on language management has been provided with a preview of what an alternative approach to language education policy and planning may bring to this society. Concepts of complexity theory and language leadership are introduced and applied to language policy and planning in order to illustrate how emergent language behavior can become part of language education policy. Speech communities and interested communities of practice, they are understood herein as complex organizations in which de facto language policies are created based on the community's true communicative needs with a number of leaders to introduce and carry them out. Language management, which then translate these de facto policies into de jure policies supported by relevant documentation, is thus accompanied by language leadership, which makes the standard language corpus more sensitive to the ever-changing communicative needs as well as social and cultural meanings and interpretations of our language of choices. To end this report, I am Reinne Balines reporting. Thank you and God bless.